It wasn't the kind of job you dreamed about as a child. There's no class in high school that prepares you to carry the dead into fire. No brochure with smiling faces that says, "Begin your career in a crematorium." For most people, this is a job that happens when something else falls apart. And for me, it came after everything else had. I was 39, divorced, bankrupt, sleeping on a pull-out sofa in my cousin's garage when I found the listing. Technician needed, experience not required, discretion essential. There was no company name, just a phone number and a 3-word line at the bottom. Rivers End Crematory. The name meant nothing to me. I called because I had nothing to lose, and by the following week I was standing at the edge of a narrow service road, shivering in the rain, staring up at a building that looked more like a disused warehouse than a place where families said goodbye. The crematorium sat on the outskirts of town, hemmed in by dying trees and a river that no one swam in anymore. The front door was always locked. Staff used a metal side gate with a key card. The interview lasted 7 minutes. A man named Charles, thin, gray, and so still I thought at first he might be a sculpture, handed me a non-disclosure form, told me not to be late, and said the first week would determine whether I was cut out for it. There was no orientation, no handbook, only a single phrase spoken on my way out that stuck with me. There are things we don't write down. My first shift began before sunrise. The building was quiet, unnervingly so. Even the overhead lights buzzed in a subdued way, as if careful not to wake the dead. There were 4 of us in total, Charles, myself, and 2 older technicians, Rudy and Eliza, who had the blank-eyed expressions of people who'd long stopped reacting to anything unexpected. No one explained the machinery. No one offered a tour. I was simply handed a jumpsuit, shown the staging room, and told to observe. The cremation process itself wasn't what I expected. There was no violence in it, no sound of screaming flames or bursting pressure. Everything was contained, industrial, clinical. The body entered the chamber through a retractable metal platform. The furnace sealed behind it. Then the heat, over 2,600 degrees Fahrenheit, did what it was designed to do. Bones reduced to fragments, flesh to vapor. Organs, if not removed beforehand, disappeared without protest. We raked the remains, collected the ash, placed them in urns. At first I thought the job might be tolerable. Morbid, sure, but efficient. A machine like any other, burning away grief. But even during those early hours I felt something watching, or perhaps not watching. That would imply eyes, but waiting, as if the building itself listened to every breath we took, weighing our words, deciding whether we would be allowed to stay. There was a rhythm to the work, and I learned quickly not to interrupt it. The staging area, where bodies arrived in sealed metal trays. The prep station, where paperwork was checked and tags confirmed. The furnace room, the raking tools, the bone grinders. Every step had its place, every action a purpose. But it wasn't the machines that taught me how to survive. It was Rudy, who broke his silence only once that first week, when I reached toward a strange discoloration on the floor near Chamber 2. He grabbed my wrist so fast I didn't see his hand move. "Don't touch what doesn't belong to you," he said. Then he nodded toward the wall, where a laminated sheet displayed the technical specifications for the furnace, and muttered, "Some rules aren't written there." That night, I dreamed of smoke curling under locked doors. Over the next few days, I began to notice things. Small things at first. The way no one ever worked alone past 11 p.m., even though the schedule said otherwise. How every technician double-checked the chamber's status lights before turning their back. How Eliza, usually mute and distant, would hum a low, broken melody whenever we opened Chamber 3. And then there was the smell. Not the expected odor of sterilization chemicals or burnt metal, but something that hung in the air just before the ignition cycle. A scent that didn't match anything I knew. Damp soil, rotting leaves, the sweetness of overripe fruit. A shifting, living aroma that changed day to day, body to body. Charles never acknowledged it. When I asked, he said, "Ash smells like ash. If you're smelling more, you're breathing too deep." But I wasn't alone. I caught Rudy once, wiping his eyes as he backed away from Chamber 1, muttering under his breath. Eliza never looked at the flames, not even once. I didn't understand it then, but that silence, that orchestrated refusal to acknowledge the anomalies, was its own kind of language. One designed not to invite curiosity, but to suppress it. On the 6th day, we received an urgent cremation. No family present, no religious rites, just a body tagged with a municipal sticker and a chain of custody form signed by an agency I didn't recognize. The bag was already sealed and placed in the chamber when I entered the room. I was told not to open it, not to read the name, not to ask questions. "Sometimes we serve the state," said Charles, as if that explained anything. When I asked if that was legal, he only replied, "We don't write it down." That was the first time I heard the phrase spoken without irony, without hesitation. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a rule. I stayed quiet. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the scent of something metallic still clinging to my hands. I began to wonder not just about the rules I was being taught, but the ones that had been buried. Rules passed down not in manuals or briefings, but in looks, in silences, in scars. I started keeping my own list. And the first entry, scribbled in the back of a receipt with trembling fingers, was this. Rule 1. Trust what your body notices, even if no one else does. By the end of that first week, I had seen 10 bodies burn. I had helped sift their remains, crushed their bones into powder, and handed their ashes to couriers who would never ask where they came from. I had learned how to clean the filters, how to avoid overloading the chamber, how to track the temperature fluctuations down to the decimal, but I had also begun to understand that knowledge here was a trap. The more you knew, the more you noticed. The more you noticed, the more you were seen, not by the people, not even by the dead, but by the space between them, the thin place, the crease in the world where the fire doesn't just consume, it listens. I didn't have a word for it then. I still don't. But I knew one thing. There were 5 rules. Not 4, not 6, 5. Everyone who worked there understood them, even if they denied it, and no one ever wrote them down. That was how it began, with ashes, with silence, with that first whisper of something wrong beneath the hum of the furnace. I stayed. I kept coming back, because by then it was too late to pretend the fire only burned what we gave it, and because I had to know, not just what happened inside the chamber, but what waited beyond it. The human mind has a way of adapting to horror by reducing it to routine. That's what I told myself during my second week at River's End. If you do the same thing enough times, even death loses its teeth. The body arrives, sealed and tagged. You verify the identity, initiate the cycle, monitor the combustion, rake, cool, grind, package. A process of disassembly so refined it almost feels sacred. Almost. But there was one thing I couldn't adapt to. One thing that followed me home no matter how many times I scrubbed my skin, washed my uniform, or left the windows open overnight. The smell, not the odor of death. That's easy enough to rationalize. No, this was something else. Something colder, older. A residue that clung to the lungs, to the memory, like it had been part of the air long before the building was ever constructed. The first time I noticed the difference, I was in Chamber 2, finishing a raking cycle. The chamber had cooled slightly, and I reached in with the long metal rake to spread the bone fragments evenly before transferring them to the cooling tray. That's when it hit me. A wave of scent so sharp and distinct it stunned me in place. It wasn't the usual composite of burnt calcium, scorched steel, or singed fabric. This was sweeter, like jasmine soaked in vinegar, with a thick undercurrent of something like ammonia. I pulled back instinctively and removed my mask, thinking perhaps it had malfunctioned. My eyes watered, and my stomach churned. When I turned around, I saw Eliza watching me from the other room through the glass. She didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Later that day, she slipped me a folded paper towel in the break room. Inside it was a single clove. "Put it under your tongue," she said, not looking up from her tea. "Helps filter it out, sometimes." I didn't ask what it was. I didn't have to, because that night I smelled it again. Not in the crematorium, but in my apartment. A 1-bedroom sublet with no ventilation issues and no memory of death. I was brushing my teeth when it crept up behind me. That same sickly perfume of floral rot and chemical sting, threading through the bathroom tiles like it had been hiding in the plumbing. I checked the drains. I opened every window. I burned incense and boiled vinegar and doused my hands in citrus cleaner. Nothing worked. I couldn't sleep. I kept getting up to check the floorboards, the vents, the closet. My eyes were dry by morning. When I returned to work, I didn't mention it. I didn't have to. Eliza handed me a handful of cloves. "You opened a door," she said, barely above a whisper. It noticed. From that day on, the smell became a barometer. I began to map its presence like one would track weather patterns. Some days nothing, a clean burn, a quiet shift. Other times, it would begin before the body even arrived, lingering in the chamber as if whatever caused it had visited during the night. I began to keep a journal, noting the temperature, the body's origin, any anomalies in the paperwork. I found no correlation. Some of the strongest reactions came from cremations that were supposedly routine. Elderly, natural death, no criminal history. But the scent would thicken, grow more assertive, like the air itself was rebelling. I asked Rudy once if he ever noticed a difference. He didn't look up from his filter maintenance. "It's not what you smell," he said. "It's what it remembers." That line haunted me. What could a room remember? What could fire remember? I started noticing how the technicians moved around the chambers, subtle shifts in their posture. Eliza always averted her gaze when standing near the exhaust ducts. Rudy double-checking the chamber's seal, then placing his hand on the metal surface like someone saying a prayer. Charles, when he worked the night shift alone, carried a small glass vial in his breast pocket. I saw him open it once, a dark liquid, thick like syrup. He dabbed it on his wrist like cologne, then whispered something under his breath before starting the burn. I asked him what it was. "Oil of hyssop," he said, "for the scent that doesn't leave." By the third week, I understood Rule 1, though no one had spoken it aloud to me yet. I only learned the exact phrasing during a training session for a new technician, a young man named Will. Charles led the briefing, sparse as always, but when Will asked if the smell was dangerous, Charles paused. That alone was strange. He wasn't a man given to hesitation. "If you smell something you can't explain," he said slowly, "you report it. You do not ignore it, and you do not describe it out loud. That's Rule 1. Will laughed. "What, it's like Beetlejuice? I say it 3 times and it shows up?" Charles didn't laugh. Eliza stood up and walked out of the room. Later that evening, Will vomited in the furnace room. He said the smell hit him while transferring remains. That same jasmine vinegar ash perfume. He tried to make a joke of it, said he'd get used to it, said it was just nerves. 3 days later, Will didn't show up for work. His badge was found on the pavement outside the main gate. No one called him. No one visited his apartment. Charles quietly removed his name from the schedule. That was when I knew. The smell wasn't a byproduct. It wasn't a chemical anomaly or a malfunction in the ventilation. It was something else. A signal, a symptom, an invitation. One night, during the graveyard shift, I was alone in the staging room, checking the documentation on a transfer. The air was still, no active burns. The building was quiet except for the low thrum of the industrial water heater in the wall. I looked up from the clipboard and caught it. A flicker of movement near the door to Chamber 1. Something dark, low to the ground, like a shadow crawling across linoleum. I stepped toward it, and the scent hit me with full force, so sudden it felt like I'd been slapped. I staggered back, vision blurred, heart racing. I turned on every light in the facility, searched every corner, found nothing. But when I passed Chamber 1 again, the temperature reading was 12 degrees higher than it had been 5 minutes before. The chamber was off. That was the night I etched Rule 1 into my journal. Never ignore a smell that changes. It is not just memory. It is not just rot. It is how it speaks. I slept in my car for the rest of that week. Rudy once told me, while fixing a faulty timer, that the crematorium had burned over 6,000 bodies since it opened. He said that with enough ash, you could build a whole new person out of what's left behind. But it wouldn't be someone you'd want to meet, he added. I didn't ask what he meant. I just remembered the way the scent changed from body to body, how sometimes it would vanish mid-burn, as if whatever had been present had left, and how other times it would intensify, stretch through the vents, seep under the office door. There's a reason Rule 1 comes first. It's the only warning you ever get. The furnace has no conscience, the heat does not care, but the scent does. It remembers, and when it changes, it's not the chamber that's malfunctioning, it's the veil, that invisible line between what you expect and what waits. If you pretend it's nothing, it grows bolder. If you name it, it listens. But if you learn to smell it, if you acknowledge its language without arrogance, sometimes, just sometimes, it passes you by. I was still learning that balance, still deciding if I even wanted to know what it meant. But one thing was already certain. River's End didn't just burn the dead. It attracted something that noticed when you breathed too deep. And it had taken Will. I didn't intend to be next. There's a specific moment, during the cremation cycle, when the flames reach their most intense color. Not orange or yellow, as you'd expect, but a kind of shimmering blue-white that pulses behind the heat-proof glass like a heart learning to beat again. That light is hypnotic. There's no other word for it. New technicians always get caught staring into it, like moths to a false sun. But after a while, those who stay long enough learn not to look. Not directly, not for too long. Not unless they want to start seeing things that aren't part of any official manual. That's rule 2. Never look too long at the glass during combustion. Not because of heat or radiation or flash burns, but because of the shadows that sometimes move within it. Shadows that don't belong to the body inside. The first time it happened, I was midway through an afternoon shift, working with Charles. It was a simple case. Elderly, natural death, cremation requested per will, all paperwork in order. We placed the body into Chamber 3 and began the ignition sequence. The chamber lit with its usual thunderous hum, and the white-blue pulse flickered to life. Charles stepped away to check something at the control console. I remained standing there, staring into the furnace, absent-mindedly watching the waves of flame ripple and fold. And then I saw it, just for a second so short, I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. A silhouette, impossibly clear, stepping forward within the chamber. Not the curled outline of a body on a tray, but something standing upright, tall and narrow, like a man with arms stretched down and fingers brushing against his knees. The shape shimmered, paused, and then receded, as if it had noticed me noticing it. I blinked, and it was gone. The chamber returned to its mechanical rhythm. But my breath had caught in my chest, and a chill had begun at the base of my neck that refused to leave. I didn't mention it, not right away. That night I stayed late, pretending to finish logs, and asked Rudy if he'd ever seen anything strange during a burn. He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a worn scrap of paper from his locker. It was an old Polaroid, faded and warped by time. The photo showed one of the furnace doors, back when the crematorium used a different model. A faint silhouette could be seen through the glass. Unmistakably human, unmistakably standing. This was taken in 1996, Rudy said. The guy who took it quit the next day, moved to Arizona, never answered our calls again. He slipped the photo back into his wallet and looked me dead in the eye. Rule 2, he said. You don't watch the flame, you monitor it, that's all. I didn't ask more. I didn't need to, because from that point on, the shadows returned. Sporadically, always during mid-burn, always just beyond the edge of clarity. Sometimes they would shift at the very corners of the flame. Sometimes they would seem to walk behind the burning body, as if moving along a path they'd walked 1,000 times before. But what disturbed me most was how those shapes never looked surprised, never frantic, never even hesitant. They moved with purpose, like they knew the room, like they knew us. After 3 weeks, I started noticing patterns. The shadows, when they appeared, always came during certain types of burns. Young men, military tags, bodies received through state custody with sealed causes of death. I checked the logs when I could, but many of those entries were incomplete. Some were entirely absent. There were gaps in the digital records that made no sense. Skipped IDs, mismatched timestamps, unregistered weights. When I brought it up to Charles, he stared at me for a long moment before replying, "There are burns that don't leave behind just ash." I don't know what he meant. I still don't. But the phrase haunted me. I began to dread opening the chamber doors, not because of what I might see directly, but because of what might be waiting for me through the glass, not reflected, but watching. One evening, Eliza told me her own story in her usual clipped tone, never stopping her hands as she cleaned a raking tool. "Saw one turn its head once," she said. "Didn't even flinch when the flame passed through it. Just kept looking like it had all the time in the world." She dipped the tool into disinfectant and added, "People think the fire purifies, but all it does is reveal." We learned early on to distract ourselves during the cycle. Some techs monitored the temperature readings and refused to glance toward the chamber. Others turned their backs entirely. I tried both methods, but sometimes, just sometimes, I couldn't help myself. One night, working alone for a few minutes while Rudy stepped out to take a call, I caught myself drifting again, my eyes locked on Chamber 2. The blue-white light pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat just under the surface. I saw no shadows this time, No silhouette. But I felt something pull at me, a warmth that was not heat, a pressure in my chest like memory reawakened. My eyes burned, not from smoke, but from something behind the glass that I could not see, only sense. A presence that was not content to be observed. That was the night I stopped sleeping in my apartment and started keeping the Polaroid Rudy gave me in my wallet. Not because I believed it would protect me, but because I needed to know it was real, that I wasn't the only one. I've read about pareidolia, about the brain's tendency to find faces and figures in meaningless patterns, clouds, fire, static. But there's a point where statistical probability breaks. There's a point where everyone starts seeing the same figure in the same place under the same light. And when that happens, it's no longer a coincidence. It's an invitation. A few weeks after Will disappeared, we had a new hire. Another young tech, this one named Jenna. Bright, eager, skeptical. She asked too many questions and laughed too easily. On her second shift, she stared into the flame for almost 2 full minutes. I watched from the prep station as her smile faded. Her eyes grew wide, unblinking, her hand trembling slightly on the railing. When the burn ended, she turned to me and said, "I think something moved in there." I didn't reply. I just handed her a scrap of paper and said, "Write it down, then destroy it." That became my habit. Whenever I saw the shadows, I recorded the time, the chamber, the body ID, and then burned the note in the incinerator behind chamber 1. Not because I thought it would stop anything, but because it felt wrong to keep the memory alive anywhere other than in my own head, as if preserving it would somehow feed it. And deep down, I suspected that the shadows didn't want to be remembered, only acknowledged. Rule 2 doesn't exist to protect us from hallucination. It exists to protect us from recognition. If you stare too long, you don't just see something. Something sees you back. And once that happens, the shadows grow more defined. They start lingering longer. They start moving closer. And eventually, you stop asking whether the flame is showing you the truth or whether it's opening a door you'll never be able to close again. The furnace burns the body, but the glass shows what burns beneath. Every building has a door you're not supposed to open. Sometimes it's a matter of safety. Electrical closets, boiler rooms, back exits wired to alarms. But at River's End, there was one door no one ever talked about, one that wasn't on any map, one whose key no one admitted to having. It sat in the far end of the back corridor, past the old file room and behind a line of wheeled supply cabinets that looked like they hadn't moved in years. You could walk by it every day and never notice. The metal frame had been painted the same flat gray as the walls, and there was no placard, no handle, only a keyhole under a small rusted latch and a faint square of dust where a sign might have once hung. No one ever referred to it, not in schedules, not in procedures. And yet everyone avoided it with the same unconscious precision as someone stepping around a hole they cannot see, but instinctively know is there. I only noticed it after a month on the job. I'd been sent to the back corridor to retrieve more urn bags and disposable gloves. The shelves were cluttered with disorganized boxes, old binders, and shrink-wrapped stacks of paperwork labeled in faded handwriting. I was reaching for a crate near the floor when I felt it, a pulse of cold air brushing against my ankle. I froze. There were no vents back there, no air conditioning ducts, no windows, and yet the draft was unmistakable. I stood up slowly and followed it with my eyes, expecting to find a vent or a broken tile. Instead, I saw the outline of that door, just barely, behind a rack of broken mop handles and cleaning fluid. At first, I didn't realize it was a door at all. It looked sealed, the kind of wall fixture that gets bricked up and forgotten, but the lock was intact, and something in the dust pattern told me it had been opened. Not recently, but not long enough ago for time to erase the evidence completely. A curved scuff mark on the floor, a single scratch near the base where the metal had been chipped. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. I assumed it was an old service closet, probably condemned or unused since a past renovation. But the more time I spent in the crematorium, the more I realized how deliberate its absence was. Every hallway had been renovated, every closet, every cabinet, every furnace inspected and logged. But not that door. There were no blueprints of that wing past 2009. The hallway's electrical panel didn't match the rest of the system, and no cameras pointed in that direction, as if someone wanted it left in the margins of the map, like the edges of old cartography marked with dragons and sea monsters. It wasn't until my second month that someone finally acknowledged it. We were doing routine maintenance on Chamber 1. and Charles was explaining the ignition relay to Jenna, the new tech. I was standing nearby, watching, when a faint metallic noise echoed from the corridor behind us. It was soft, a single hollow click, like a latch slipping into place. Everyone stopped moving. Jenna looked confused. I looked at Charles. His expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Keep working," he said. "If you hear anything from the back hallway, you ignore it." Jenna chuckled nervously. "What was it?" He didn't answer, just said again, "Ignore it." And that was when I knew. The door wasn't forgotten. It was feared. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stayed behind under the pretense of double-checking the fluid stock. I waited until the cameras rotated away, then crept down the back hall. The door looked the same, still unmarked, still silent. I pressed my ear to the metal and waited. For a while, nothing. Just the distant hum of the furnace's residual heat through the building. And then, the faintest sound. Not speech, not movement, just breath, long and slow and rhythmically human. I stepped back, heart pounding. The lock hadn't changed, but the air near the floor was colder, much colder. When I returned to the staging room, Eliza was there. She wasn't supposed to be. She stood in the dark, holding a mop like a weapon, her eyes narrow. She didn't say a word, just pointed at me with her chin and said, "Don't go near that door again, not even to look." I asked her why. She exhaled sharply through her nose. "Because it opens from the inside, if you look long enough." She turned and walked away, leaving the mop propped against the wall like an unsent warning. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed thinking about the scuff marks, the breath, the cold. I kept imagining someone, something, on the other side of that door, standing just inches away, waiting for someone to break the pattern, to twist the latch, to ask the wrong question. In the following days, I began to notice more. The technicians always cleaned the back hallway quickly. They never stacked supplies near the door. Even Charles, usually so composed, would hesitate for a fraction of a second before assigning anyone to that side of the building. And occasionally, late at night, the hallway lights would flicker once, just once, and return to normal. No errors logged in the system, no outages, just one pulse, as if something had brushed its hand against the circuit. I asked Rudy about it again. He was sitting outside on his smoke break, though I never once saw him actually light a cigarette, just held it between his fingers like a totem. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd heard. He looked out across the empty lot and said, "We burn the dead, but not everything we burn was alive, not in the way you think." I pressed him, "What's behind the door?" He shook his head. "We don't know. We're not supposed to. But if you ever hear it open and someone calls your name from inside, you run. Doesn't matter who it sounds like." He crushed the cigarette into his palm and stood. "Rule 3, he said. "That door stays closed, always." That was the first time someone said it out loud. The third rule. Like the first two, it wasn't written anywhere. It wasn't in the training. It wasn't in the manual. But everyone knew it. Every technician, every janitor, even the delivery drivers avoided that hallway. I once saw one stop short when his cart veered too far to the left. He backed away and made a nervous joke. I laughed along. But the laughter felt borrowed, like the joke wasn't for us, but for something listening just out of view. Over time, I learned the signs. When the cold came first, when the latch clicked without being touched, when the hallway lights dimmed in rhythm with your breath, those were the times to leave your tools where they were and walk away. No questions, no glances, just distance. I began logging those incidents in a separate notebook, one I never brought home, and slowly, a pattern emerged. The door seemed to react, not to the bodies, not to the burns, but to us, to proximity, to attention, to memory. Rule 3 isn't about locks, it's about curiosity, about keeping your mind where your hands are. The moment you start wondering what's behind it, it hears you, it waits, and if you linger too long, it decides you're ready. Ready for what? I don't know. I never opened the door, but I've seen what happens to people who try. A technician named Harper used to work the early shifts, neat, polite, always humming. One day she went to retrieve supplies from the back corridor and never returned. Her keycard was found half swiped in the reader. Her shoes were placed neatly beside the shelf. The cameras were offline that morning. Scheduled maintenance. Charles said she quit, but no one ever called. No one ever filled her spot. and her name was erased from the schedule within the hour. I still pass that hallway. I still feel the cold on certain nights. And once, only once, I heard my own name whispered, faintly, from the far end. I didn't stop. I didn't turn. I walked until the sound of my footsteps drowned everything else out. And that's why Rule 3 matters. Because the dead burn clean. But the things behind that door, they remember the heat, and they want out. There's something reassuring about paperwork. It pretends to be objective, to be neutral. It presents itself as truth on a page, permanent and verifiable. In a place like River's End, where the walls hold more than just heat, that illusion of order is seductive. You want to believe the register knows what's real, that the names, the dates, the times, the weights, that they mean something, that the dead are accounted for, that nothing goes missing, that everything has a place. But that's a lie. I know it now. The register lies. And like everything else in that place, the lie isn't accidental. It's deliberate. It's protective. It's the only thing standing between us and something we don't fully understand. It started with a discrepancy, a small one, a name I recognized from the local paper. Richard Wilkes, age 56, heart attack. His obituary ran the same week we processed his remains. I remembered it clearly because his daughter had requested that a small tin of ash be separated and given to her privately. Charles handled it himself, said he knew the family. But a few days later, as I was helping organize the digital logbook, I noticed something odd. The entry for Wilkes was missing, not just mislabeled or misfiled, absent, as if it had never happened. I checked the physical intake logs. Nothing. I checked the chain of custody folder. Blank space where his name should have been. But I remembered the body, the weight, the tray number. I remembered Charles carrying the urn out to the delivery van himself. I asked him about it. He stared at me for a long moment and said, "Must be a clerical error." But his voice lacked conviction. He was a man who never made mistakes. The next day, another entry vanished. This time it was even stranger. A body listed as Jane Doe. No known family, coroner's order, standard procedure. I had processed her myself 2 weeks earlier. Her ashes had gone unclaimed and were scheduled for dispersal through the municipal program. I remembered the smell during her burn, sharp like copper and rain. The chamber temperature had fluctuated wildly during the cycle, something that almost never happened. The igniter sensors even registered a brief reverse surge, which the maintenance logs flagged but never explained. And now she was gone. The digital file was corrupted. The paper record was torn, not at the edges, but through the center of her name, almost like someone had traced over the letters with a box cutter. No backup, no shadow log, just blank space where a person had once been. I brought it up to Rudy. He didn't look surprised. He just lit a cigarette and said, "It happens. You learn not to chase the missing ones." I asked what that meant. He shrugged. "Some burns. They don't leave behind paperwork, not because they weren't filed. Because the fire doesn't allow it." I didn't know what to say. The idea that combustion, a mechanical chemical process, could edit memory, could erase bureaucracy, felt insane. And yet the more I looked, the more patterns emerged. Bodies tied to government agencies, deaths with conflicting time of death stamps, weight logs that fluctuated more than physics allowed, ashes returned with grain too fine or too dense or too light. Occasionally we'd open the chamber and find less than what should have remained. Once we found more. Eliza found me reviewing the logs one night, going page by page through the last 3 months. I had pinned up photocopies across the break room wall, drawing lines with a red marker like someone unraveling a conspiracy. She stood there, quiet, for several minutes before finally saying, "They won't let you keep that up." I asked who. She didn't answer, just walked up to the wall and tore down a sheet. "You're looking for consistency, but this place doesn't run on consistency. It runs on containment." I asked her if the records had ever been complete, if the register had ever told the full truth. She shook her head slowly. "No, but it tells enough to keep people from asking too much. That's the trick. The system needs to pretend it's working." A few days later, my access to the digital archive was revoked. Charles said it was due to a security review and handed me a new role: inventory and furnace scheduling. Away from the logs, away from the names. But it was too late. The lie had already seeded itself inside me. I couldn't unsee the gaps. I couldn't pretend the missing lines were typos or accidents. I started making copies, scanning entries, saving them to encrypted drives, writing notes in the margins with code names. One entry read simply, Chamber 2, 2241, no residue. Another, ash weight less than half expected, no bone. I logged smells, sounds, fluctuations, names that disappeared, files that degraded overnight. I kept them all. Then one night, the register erased someone in real time. Jenna was processing a burn, a middle-aged man, motorcycle accident, routine. I watched her enter the data, time of ignition, weight, ID tag, initials. We turned our backs for a few minutes to prep the next cycle. When we came back, the screen was blank. The entire line of data gone. Not even a system error, just a clean gap. Jenna paled. She tried to re-enter the info, but the system wouldn't accept it. The tag number had already been used, according to the database. But there was no corresponding entry. No evidence the person had ever existed. She looked at me, panicked. He was real, she said. He was just here. And I believed her, because I remembered him too. Rule 4 hadn't been introduced yet, but I was beginning to understand that the crematorium didn't just burn bodies. It burned evidence. It filtered memory. It digested the truth and returned something simpler, something cleaner. A record that made sense on paper, even if it didn't match reality. And it wasn't just the digital files. The physical register, the thick black binder with entries stretching back years, began to change. Old pages yellowed overnight. Ink faded. Whole sections disappeared. Sometimes a page would reappear, but with different names, different dates. Once I found my own name, printed faintly in an entry scheduled for next year. It was gone the next morning. I stopped sleeping after that. The deeper I went, the more I felt watched. Not by Charles, not by Eliza or Rudy, but by the building itself, by the paper, by the ink. As if the register didn't want to be read, only obeyed. As if the entries it retained weren't a record, but a boundary, a way to keep something in or out. The 5th week, I found a name I shouldn't have. A man who had died 2 months prior, a quiet, unremarkable passing, but who had also died the year before that. 2 entries, same name, same age, same cause of death, different cremation dates, different ashes. I checked the delivery records. Both urns had been sent. I tracked down the funeral home listed. They said both ceremonies had taken place. I asked how that was possible. They hung up on me. That was when I knew. The register wasn't broken. It was doing exactly what it had been built to do. Not track, not record, but redirect. The crematorium was a conduit, and the paperwork was camouflage. A map of truths, carefully arranged to disguise something older, something unfiled. Rudy said once that every burn is a question, and the ashes are the answer. But the register doesn't show you the question. It shows you the answer it thinks you can handle. The rest, it feeds back into the flame. And that's when I learned Rule 4 was coming. Because sometimes, when the answers get too loud, the only thing you can do is stop being alone. The 4th rule wasn't spoken to me like the others. It wasn't written on a post-it, whispered during a cigarette break, or hinted at through a cryptic comment over cooling trays of ash. I learned it by violation, by crossing an invisible threshold of time and presence. Midnight, they say, is just another tick of the clock. But at River's End, it was more than that. It was a turning, a shedding, as if the building itself changed its breath pattern, as if the walls relaxed their hold on the world we thought we knew and exhaled something else, something older, stranger, and far more attentive. My shift that night wasn't supposed to extend past 10:30. Jenna had called out sick, or said she was, and Rudy was late returning from a funeral home delivery across county lines. Charles had already gone home. Eliza was covering a day shift the next morning and had left early. That left me alone, something I was technically authorized to handle for a short window, but which everyone avoided by unspoken consensus. I wasn't afraid, not yet. I'd stayed past curfew before, 30 minutes here, an hour there, always while someone else was in the building. But that night was the first time I heard the furnace hum shift pitch after midnight. Not louder, just deeper, like it had dropped into a lower gear, as if something under the building was grinding awake. It was 12:04 a.m. when the register screen glitched. Not crashed, glitched. The entries wavered, flickered like film melting in reverse, then reassembled with slight differences. names that weren't there before, weights that made no biological sense. One body was logged at 32 pounds, another at 397. None of them had paperwork. None were familiar. I backed away from the monitor, my chest tight, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not heavy ones. Not boots. Bare skin slapping lightly against cold tile. From the far end of the back hallway, where the closed door lived, where no one was supposed to be. I moved slowly to the intercom. I pressed the talk button, not expecting anyone to answer. "Is someone still inside?" I asked, voice dry. A few seconds of static, then a whisper. Not a voice, not even language, but the memory of one. It curled around the speaker like breath behind glass. I let go of the button. The hallway lights flickered once, then again, and then stayed off. When I stepped out to check the breaker, the smell hit me. That same floral rot from Rule 1, but sharper now, hungrier. I returned to the staging room and locked the door. The key turned with more resistance than usual. I could hear the elevator rattling down the shaft even though no one had called it. The indicator lights stayed dark. I checked the chamber readings. All inactive. No burns scheduled. No heat detected. But the temperature in the room began to rise anyway. 1 degree, then 2, then 5. My hands trembled. I wiped sweat from my brow and found ash instead. It wasn't mine. At 12:19, the intercom buzzed again. A single chime. I ignored it. It buzzed again. This time a voice, but not from the speaker. From inside the staging room, behind the row of stainless steel cabinets. I heard my name, whispered, then spoken, then repeated, with growing familiarity. A voice I hadn't heard in months. Will's voice, the technician who had vanished. "Come help me," it said. "I don't know how to get back." I closed my eyes, told myself it wasn't real, that the register's ghost entries, the door, the shadows, it was all fatigue, hallucination, my mind trying to protect me from overexposure. But when I opened my eyes, the camera feed on the main screen had changed. Instead of the empty hallway, it showed the inside of the furnace. Chamber 2, fully active, flames pulsing. But no one had turned it on. I checked the control panel. All switches off, no status lights. The system was asleep, but the camera showed movement inside the fire. Something pacing, slowly. Not consumed, not flinching, just walking, back and forth. I stepped back. The smell in the room turned metallic like blood and melting copper. My phone vibrated. I looked down. A text message. No number. Just a single line. "Don't be alone after midnight." It was 12:33. I left the staging room, keys in hand. Walked past the racks of unclaimed urns, past the cold storage, past the flickering hallway, ignoring the soft scraping coming from behind the supply closet. I didn't run. I didn't speak. I just walked until I reached the front exit and swiped my card. The reader glitched. Red light, red again, then green. I stepped outside into the freezing air, and for the first time that night, I could breathe. Rudy was waiting in the parking lot, engine running, staring through the windshield like he'd been there the whole time. I opened the door and sat beside him. He didn't ask what happened, just handed me a small bag of salt and said, "Put a line across your doorway when you get home, and sleep with the lights on." He looked at me. His eyes were hollow. "You stayed too long. Now it knows your name." The next morning, Charles called me in early. He didn't mention the furnace anomaly, didn't ask why I left early. But as I passed his office, I saw the staff schedule taped to the door. A new rule was scribbled underneath in thick marker. No technician works alone after 11:59 p.m. No signature, no explanation, just a new truth. That's when I understood what Rule 4 really meant. It wasn't about danger. It was about exposure. About the walls between you and it becoming too thin when there's no one else to buffer the space. The moment you're alone, you become visible. Accessible. The whispers know when no one can confirm what you heard. The cameras don't save what happens. The registers don't record the entries. And the fire watches with no distractions. I asked Eliza, later that week, if anyone had ever broken the rule and stayed alone past midnight more than once. She didn't answer, just rubbed a deep, jagged scar near her temple and said, "We don't talk about them. River's End doesn't just cremate the dead. After midnight, it calls the living. And if you're alone, it might just answer." Rules 1 through 4, for all their unspoken terror, were at least consistent. They had rhythms, patterns, triggers you could learn to anticipate. The smell before the anomaly, the glass before the shadow, the door before the breath, the hour before the invitation. But Rule 5 was different. It had no threshold, no warning, no procedural anchor. It was only ever mentioned in whispers or avoided with silence. Even Rudy, who'd taught me more than any manual could, lowered his eyes when I asked. Charles, when pressed, deflected with protocol. Eliza walked away without a word, but I had already heard enough to understand what the rule was. You could feel it in the way conversations abruptly stopped when someone mentioned movement inside a sealed chamber, or when someone flinched at a knock, soft and distinct, from the interior of a furnace mid-cycle. The rule, as I finally understood it, was this: if someone knocks from inside, you do not open. It sounds absurd until you've heard it, until you're alone on an empty shift, standing in the furnace room, and you hear it, 3 soft, perfectly spaced taps, as deliberate as a coded message, as human as skin against steel. The first time it happened to me, I thought it was the ductwork, the pressure equalizing, a pipe shifting. I was walking past chamber 3 after a standard burn. Everything had gone normally. 90-minute cycle, residual heat within expected range, ash weight matching intake, no smell, no shadow, no error. I had just reached for the rake to begin collection when the sound came from behind the chamber door. 3 knocks. Not loud, not urgent, but real. I froze, waited, heard nothing. Then again, tap, 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 slower this time. I leaned in, against every instinct. The chamber was sealed, cooling. The fire had gone out over 20 minutes earlier, but I felt warmth. Not heat from the metal, but a pulsing warmth, like breath pressed to the inside of a wall. I stepped back, locked the rake into place, left the remains where they were. When I returned with Charles 10 minutes later, there was no sound. The temperature was normal. The ash inside was undisturbed. We said nothing to each other, but as he turned to leave, he said flatly, "Good, you didn't open it." I wanted to ask what would have happened if I had. I didn't, because even then, I knew there wasn't an answer I wanted. Later that week, I asked Rudy if he'd ever heard the knocks. He didn't answer immediately, just stared at the chamber wall like it was remembering him too. Finally, he said, "It only knocks for those who are listening." Then, softer, "Some people hear a name in the knock. Some people hear nothing. The ones who hear a voice, they're the ones who break the rule." I asked what happens then. Rudy crushed his cigarette without lighting it. "We don't talk about them." One of the oldest technicians on record at River's End, a man named Wallace, had reportedly vanished during a solo morning prep in the 90s. His disappearance was never officially investigated. The log said he clocked in at 6:02 a.m. A burn was started at 6:10. His card was last scanned at 6:13. At 6:45, the chamber shut down. When another tech arrived at 7:00, Wallace was gone. His car still in the lot. The chamber, empty, no ashes, no body, no remains of any kind. The entry in the register simply read, "System reset." I tracked down that register myself. It had been moved to a locked cabinet in Charles's office. When I finally accessed it, under the guise of archiving, I found the entry circled in red ink, not Wallace's name, just the phrase, "He opened it." Rule 5 isn't about safety. It's not about fire, pressure, liability. It's about containment, about preventing something from stepping out of a place it was never meant to leave. The knock isn't a malfunction. It isn't a coincidence. It's a test, a threshold, a question asked in silence, and the moment you answer, you give it permission. I started recording the knocks when they happened. Always 3, sometimes louder, sometimes faint. Occasionally a 4th knock would follow after a pause, slower, deeper, like a decision had been made. I noticed they happened more frequently after burns that registered less than 100 pounds of ash, or those with military tags, or those with names missing from the registry. I played the recordings for Eliza once. She listened, then stood up and left the room. An hour later, her locker was empty. She never came back. I tried playing the recordings backward, slowed down the audio, filtered for frequencies. I heard murmurs, low hums like voices behind water. Once I heard my own name. I deleted the file. Then came the night I almost broke the rule. I was alone, again. Midnight had passed. I had stayed to complete an emergency intake. A body dropped off by a third-party transport. No ID, just a chain of custody note from a contractor. The body was sealed in triple-layered wrapping. Burn requested immediately. Charles signed off remotely, which he'd never done before. I didn't ask questions. I placed the body in chamber 2, initiated the cycle, and stood back. 17 minutes in, the flame sputtered. Not failed, just stuttered, like something inside the chamber had inhaled. The sound made my teeth hurt. Then came the knock. 1, 2, 3, then a pause. Then 4, slower, heavier. I stepped forward, hand trembling. The chamber wasn't sealed properly. The indicator blinked yellow. That had never happened before. I could smell it. Not rot, not flowers, but ozone. Thunderstorm air, metal and electricity. The control panel showed no errors, no override. But the door latch clicked softly, like it wanted to open itself. And then I heard it, my mother's voice, from inside. "Sweetheart, let me out. She died 6 years ago, cremated in another state. I had her ashes. I had watched the urn sealed, but I knew that voice, knew it in the marrow of my bones." I stepped back, sat on the floor, covered my ears. When Charles found me an hour later, I hadn't moved. He didn't speak, just helped me up, walked me outside, and locked the furnace room behind us. That night, Rule 5 was carved into the metal wall above the chamber with a soldering torch. Not printed, not laminated, carved. I asked who had done it. No one claimed credit. The knock still happens sometimes. Always at night. Always when someone's alone, even for a moment. And the hardest part isn't hearing it. It's when it uses a voice you love, and you have to choose to leave it burning. There's a point in every job where you either learn to live with the rules or you decide to question them. At River's End, that point doesn't come with a confrontation or an ultimatum. It comes quietly, like ash settling after a burn, like the final breath in a furnace chamber. You don't even realize you've crossed a line until you look down and see that you're alone, holding pieces of something no one else is willing to touch. That's how the silence breaks, not with a scream, but with a question that refuses to be buried. Mine came the day I discovered the file. It was stored in a locked drawer behind Charles's desk, in a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. I wasn't supposed to be there. He was homesick for the first time I could remember, and Jenna had taken a leave of absence after hearing a knock during a solo shift. The crematorium was nearly empty. The silence was thicker than usual. I was supposed to be organizing intake forms from the past quarter, scanning paper entries into the digital archive. The drawer stuck when I pulled it, but something inside rattled loose. A manila folder, unlabeled, frayed at the edges, stuffed with photocopies and handwritten notes. There were no names on the documents, only numbers, body IDs that didn't appear in the register, chamber logs with timestamps during hours when the crematorium was officially closed, photos of ashtrays completely empty, heat signatures with no visible source. One photo, printed on thermal paper, degraded from time, showed a full-body outline in white-hot glow standing upright inside chamber 4 during a burn. The timestamp placed it at 3:16 a.m., on a date with no corresponding entry in the logs. Someone had drawn a small black X over the head in ink. On the back, a single phrase, "Do not engage." I read every page. Some were written in shorthand, in a looping cursive I recognized as Eliza's. Others were mechanical, clinical, Charles probably. Notes about heat distortion, intermittent power drains, instances of reversed airflow through the ventilation shafts. One note stopped me cold. Request from municipal authority to incinerate unknown remains from sealed transport. Warning from courier, do not document past entry. That line was circled. Next to it, a scribble in red. It burns, but it doesn't reduce. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was holding a confession, not of guilt, but of surrender. As if the people who had come before me had all reached this same wall, had all touched this same silence, and chosen, in the end, to stop asking. I couldn't. I photocopied what I could, returned the originals, and began cross-referencing them with everything I'd collected on my own. The erased register entries, the chamber temperature logs, the anomalous ash weights. Patterns emerged, a shape to the silence, a rhythm behind the omissions. I wasn't the first to see it, but I might have been the last who still cared. When I finally confronted Charles, I didn't expect him to react, but he did. Not with denial, not with anger, with weariness. like someone who'd been waiting to be caught. "You went looking," he said. "I told you not to." I placed the photocopies on his desk. "Why don't we tell anyone? Why keep it all buried?" He looked at me for a long time. Then, "Because the truth isn't useful here. It doesn't save lives. It doesn't keep the doors closed. All it does is feed the thing that wants to be remembered." That was the first time he acknowledged it. The thing. No name, no category, just an it. He didn't say more. Didn't have to. The next day I found my schedule changed. Fewer night shifts, more time in the office, more administrative duties. A leash, gentle but firm. They wanted me contained, not silenced. I started leaking pieces of what I found, anonymously at first. Forums for mortuary workers, conspiracy boards about unclassified government cremations. I shared temperature irregularities, photos of blank registry logs, stories about the knock. Most were dismissed as fiction. Some were reposted under titles like "creepypasta from a funeral home employee," but a few replies stood out. Other workers from other places, different states, similar rules, similar burns. One message read, "We call it the guest. It comes when the fire goes too deep." Another, "Our register lies too." That was when I realized it wasn't just us. River's End wasn't unique. It was a node, one point in a larger chain. A network of crematoriums, old and quiet and forgotten by design, that didn't just dispose of the dead, they suppressed something that feeds on the process, or that is the process, coiled inside the mechanisms we built to make death clean. And somewhere along the way, we made a bargain. Silence in exchange for continuity. Ignore the smell, avoid the shadows. Don't open the door, don't be alone, don't answer the knock, and above all, don't write it down. But I had already written too much. One night, a technician from another facility contacted me directly. Her message was short. "Stop, you're attracting attention," I replied. She never responded. A week later, her user account was deleted. The board was shut down. That's when I began noticing small changes. My workstation password reset itself twice in a single week. Charles avoided my eyes. Rudy no longer spoke at all. The furnace would start itself once, twice, during moments when I knew no cycle was scheduled. The smell was constant now, faint, but there, in the corners of the break room, in the water pipes, under the sleeves of my shirt, even after washing. And then the worst happened. One of my files was removed. Not deleted, removed. A handwritten page from my private notebook, the one I kept sealed in a drawer in my apartment under lock. The page had been sliced out cleanly, no residue. I knew what was written there. A diagram of the building's electrical paths, and a theory I had mapped about the flow of energy through the cremation cycles and how it might interact with the chamber anomalies. The page was gone. In its place, tucked into the notebook, was a single photograph, black and white, slightly smudged. The staging room, empty, except for a figure standing near chamber 3, unmistakably me, but facing away, in a pose I never remembered taking. The timestamp said, "Tomorrow." I stopped sharing after that. I stopped writing. I tried to disappear into routine. The fire, the rakes, the urns, the smell. But the silence didn't stop. It only grew more precise. And every time I looked at that photograph, I felt it, like the walls were leaning closer, like the crematorium was waiting for me to say the one thing no one else would, because that's what Rule 5 really protects us from. Not the thing inside the fire, but the voice that names it. And once you speak it, it speaks back. For a long time, I believed that proof would be the end of it, that if I could isolate one undeniable piece of evidence, one fragment, one reading, one ash sample that defied physics, it would all make sense. Or at least I could force someone to look, to listen, to acknowledge that River's End wasn't just a crematorium, that it was a lid over something ancient and patient and not entirely asleep. But proof is a treacherous thing. It changes nothing and ruins everything. Because once you hold it, you can never go back to doubt, and neither can the thing watching you. I began collecting samples carefully, quietly. At first it was incidental, a fragment that didn't match the profile of the body, a bit of ash with an impossible weight. Later, it was intentional. I'd pocket bone shards that hadn't fully reduced, tag them under false IDs, store them in sterilized bags in my freezer at home. I took notes, temperature logs, smell profiles, time of burn, chamber anomalies. I cross-referenced them with the erased registry entries, with the knocks, with the chamber temperatures that dropped during ignition, not after. I found patterns, recurring traits, inconsistent decay rates, elemental traces not present in human biology. One sample came back with a calcium-to-carbon ratio incompatible with any mammal. Another contained particles similar to volcanic glass, despite the furnace's temperature never exceeding 1800 degrees. A third had trace amounts of something that registered as organic on spectrometry, but produced no identifiable cell structure. That was the sample that got me the lab appointment. I paid out of pocket, under a pseudonym, claimed it was research for a fiction project. The lab tech didn't care. He took the samples, ran the standard analysis, and promised results in a week. He called me back in 2 days, panicked, told me to come alone. The report was short. The ash didn't match any known cremation profile. Some of it wasn't ash at all. It was polymeric, with trace metallic content, bonded to something crystalline. Not synthetic, not natural. The lab's equipment flagged it as biogenic, but every further test failed. No DNA, no isotopic fingerprint, no decay rate. One fragment, when viewed under scanning electron microscope, had a structure that repeated at impossible intervals, like a tessellation that should collapse but didn't. The tech said, half joking, "This didn't come from something that evolved. It came from something that was designed." He asked where I got it. I told him to destroy the sample, erase the records. He agreed too quickly. That night, the lab's online portal disappeared. The phone number disconnected the next morning. Back at River's End, I kept my head down, but the furnace knew. I don't mean that in the poetic sense. I mean it physically. Chamber 3 began reacting to my presence. I would walk into the room, and its idle sensors would blink green. I stopped entering unless someone else was nearby. My locker was opened, my notes rearranged. Charles said nothing, but his eyes held a different weight now. Not disappointment, not suspicion. Recognition. Like I had passed a threshold none of them could pull me back from. The smell followed me home. Not the usual perfume of floral, rot, or vinegar-sweet smoke. This was worse. A sulfur tang layered under the sharpness of cut copper. I began seeing marks on my walls. At first faint, fingerprints in soot, shapes like tree roots or capillaries. Then darker, circular impressions near the windows. Spirals scratched faintly into the glass from the inside. I moved. It followed. Then came the ash. Not from the crematorium, from nowhere. A fine gray dust that appeared on my kitchen counter, on my dashboard, on the rim of my coffee mug. I would wipe it, wash it, leave the house, and find it again. I collected it. It matched the sample I had given the lab, down to the impossible crystalline structure. I tried to stop, to quit. I submitted a formal notice. Charles refused it. "You can't leave right now," he said. "Not after what you've done." I asked what that meant. He didn't answer, just looked past me to the furnace room. "It knows you now." I started sleeping in the supply closet. It was the only place in the building where the lights didn't flicker. One night, I found a piece of charred paper slipped under the door. It had only one line, typed in courier font. "We burn what must not remember itself." There was no sender, no initials. I asked Rudy. He shrugged. "You're in the deep part now," he said. "The fire's thinking with you." That same week, I opened a chamber to collect ash after a burn and found a stone. Not bone, not metal. A perfectly smooth, dark sphere the size of a human eye. It was warm, vibrating faintly. I didn't touch it, just closed the chamber and marked the cycle as voided. I checked the logs. There was no entry, no intake, no ID. I mailed the sphere to a university in Maine. 3 days later, the package returned, unopened, no return address. Inside, the sphere, and a note written in ink that bled through the paper. "Don't send us this again." I gave up on external validation. I gave up on trying to expose River's End, because the proof wasn't in the data. It wasn't in the scans or the samples. It was in the pattern that formed behind your eyes after enough time in the heat. In the dreams that began as colorless fog and sharpened into a staircase, descending endlessly into a room filled with humming voices that never stopped speaking, not in words, but in intention. I once told Jenna that proof was the only thing that could set us free. She laughed, bitter. "Proof doesn't save you," she said. "Proof binds you. It means you have to make a choice." I asked what choice. She said, "Whether to let it through or not. Rule 1 teaches you to smell. Rule 2 teaches you not to look too long. Rule 3 tells you never open the wrong door. Rule 4 warns you to never be alone. Rule 5 is simple, never answer the knock. But beyond those rules, after you break the silence and gather the proof, there is no more safety. There is only proximity. And now, it is closer than ever. It wasn't supposed to be my shift. The schedule had been clear for weeks. Rudy on intake, Charles monitoring the chambers, Jenna back from leave to assist with the evening burns. I was meant to be off. I had packed a bag, booked a cabin 3 counties away, and planned to disappear for a while. Not forever. Just enough to breathe air that didn't taste like smoke and metal. But when I woke up that morning, my phone buzzed with a message I didn't remember setting up notifications for. It was from the system admin account at River's End. One line, "Your presence is required. 7 p.m., Chamber 4. I should have ignored it, should have kept driving. But something in the wording, something about required, felt like a command, not a request. And the truth is, I wasn't free. I hadn't been free since I smelled the thing that doesn't burn, since I heard the knock, since I looked into the glass too long. Proof doesn't save you. It only ties you tighter to the fire. So I turned around, drove in silence, arrived at River's End just before sundown. The building was darker than usual, not just in light, but in presence. Like the walls had pulled closer, shrinking the space from within. The air tasted like cold copper wire. I expected to find someone at the desk, but it was empty. No sign of Jenna, no smoke trailing under the side door from Rudy's fake cigarettes. Charles's office was locked from the inside. I knocked. No answer. But the register was on, and the screen displayed a single active entry. Unregistered intake. Wait. NA. Assigned. Technician 004. That was my ID. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to breathe evenly. My badge wouldn't swipe me into the back hall, but the door clicked open anyway. I passed through the corridors slowly, every light flickering once as I crossed beneath them. The furnace room was humming, all 4 chambers idle, but the sound was there anyway. Not mechanical, biological. Like something vast breathing in concert with my heartbeat. Chamber 4's panel was already unlocked. The chamber was empty, or so it appeared. I began the checklist anyway. Verified ignition protocols, ran a diagnostic, everything green, except the temperature, which registered 73 degrees, room temperature, and rising by the second. 74, 75, 78. I stepped back. The chamber wasn't on. There was a knock, not from the chamber, from the wall behind it. I turned slowly. The door, the one that must stay closed, was ajar. Not wide, just enough to see darkness beyond. Not blackness, darkness, moving. Something in the dark moved like slow smoke reaching through a slit in a membrane. I froze. Then I heard my name. Not my name as others spoke it, but the name I hadn't heard since childhood, the way my mother used to say it. The softness, the cadence. I stepped toward it. The air was thick with salt and ash and the sound of fire with no source. Then Charles's voice, behind me. Don't. I turned. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was stained. His eyes were glassy, distant. It's not your voice, he said. It's the voice it stole from you. I asked him what it was, what it had always been. He looked past me to the open door. It's the thing that remembers, the thing we feed because it must never forget itself. The fire burns memory, but not all memory wants to die. The door creaked wider. A warmth poured through. Not heat, not really. Emotion. Nostalgia soaked in decay. Longing rotted at the edge of grief. I felt the sensation of every face I'd cremated, every body I had raked, every urn I had sealed. And beyond them, others. Older, names I had never learned. Bones I had never touched. Eyes that had watched the fire from the other side of the glass. Charles walked past me, slowly, toward the door. I've done this too long, he said. It's supposed to be me. I stepped forward to stop him, but he held out his hand. No technician can leave with a name it remembers, but someone has to seal it. Then he entered. The door closed behind him, not slammed, not pulled, closed, like a breath finishing. The furnace roared awake. Chamber 4 lit with a flame I had never seen. Not blue-white, not orange-yellow, red-black, like molten coal, like a bruise that had caught fire. The temperature readout blinked erratically. I moved toward the panel, unsure what to do, unsure if I should stop it. But there was no override, no abort. Then a line of text appeared on the screen, not input by me, not typed, just appeared. One for memory, one for fire, one to never open the door again. And the countdown began. I stood there, watching the final burn, not because I wanted to, but because it wanted me to. When it was done, the chamber cooled faster than physics allowed. When I opened it, there was nothing inside. Not ash, not bone, not even soot. Only a small tag, burned at the edges. Technician ID 01, Charles. The register cleared itself. The logs returned to normal. The smell faded. But the silence was different now. He had sealed the door, but he had left me behind. I walked out of River's End without clocking out. I left my badge on the counter. My phone rang once in the car. Unknown number. I didn't answer. I haven't been back. But every few weeks, a small package arrives at my new address. No return label. Always the same thing. A single ash sample in a glass vial. And a note that says, "We are all custodians now." I don't sleep through the night. Sometimes I hear knocking on my window. Not on the glass, on the air. Because River's End never needed fire to consume. It only needed witnesses. And I was the last one left.